conclude this short introduction to Gibson-Graham's post-capitalist approach, I'd like to give just some more concrete examples of tools that can be used to unlearn economic givens and think and practice other economies. Let's consider the commons, in other words, our collectively managed resources and wealth. As we've seen, Gibson-Graham's approach can be understood as a three-step method consisting of a critique of capitalocentric frameworks, of the mapping of diverse economies, and of the collective situated negotiation of community economies. The commons is a recurring theme in this post-capitalist approach as well as many others. Gibson-Graham's particularity is to look for ways to not think of the commons as a category distinct from state-managed or market-based property or wealth, but instead focus on commoning as a process that is, I quote, applicable to any form of property, whether private or state-owned or open access, end of quote. So a more conventional approach to the commons could argue that the commons is just or primarily a legal category for collective property management. Such a perspective may be capitalocentric insofar as it leaves unexamined or unchallenged all those forms of state and capitalist property which seem something other than the commons. By implication, we may think that it is the legal battles and ultimately the making of law in parliaments that is the primary site of politics. This drastically delimits where, how, and by whom a politics of the commons may be recognized as taking place and can be amplified by scholarly and activist interventions. By emphasizing commoning as a process as opposed to the commons as a legal category, Gibson-Graham and other community economists want to build tools that would help us rethink, navigate, and transform all of the diverse forms of property in our lives, at least potentially. First, we need to map and visualize property as multiple and to start to recognize our entanglement within different frameworks of property. We can use a diverse economies table as a taxonomy and a map to help us approach this multiplicity. Or we can use something called a time property geography tool that helps us visualize our everyday movements as taking place within specific differential property frameworks. So here we see the tool called Time Property Geographies for two people, Bill and Sue, a couple. And the point of this tool is to help us think about the different forms of property, different forms of really different places we spend our time in during the everyday, in this case during one single day. So on the vertical axis we have different forms of property, again different categories for property. We have open access property, state-owned property, collectively owned private property, and individually owned private property. And on the horizontal axis we have the different hours of the day. Using this tool, we can visualize and map which category of property we spend our time in. We have two colors. One is the gray color is for Sue and the black color is for Bill. And we get to see the places that Bill and Sue spend their time in. So for instance, with Sue, she works in a hospital. She spends her night shift in the hospital in a state-owned property. Then she goes home to an individually owned private property, that is the home. She visits the school, which is again a state-owned property. Then she goes to community center in the afternoon, which is a partly state-owned, partly collectively owned private property. She also visits the internet, which is an open access property. And then again in the evening she goes back to the hospital, which is a state-owned property. So it's just a way to visualize her day and the kind of properties that she spends her time in. And in the same way for Bill, in this case, we're thinking about a coal mining town. This example is set in a coal mining town. Bill sleeps at home when Sue's in the hospital. So Bill starts his day at an individually owned private property. Then he uses roads, state-owned properties, in other words, to access the coal mine where he works. It's again an individually owned private property. Then after the workday, he goes back to the road, which is a state-owned property. He goes to the football club, which is a collectively owned private property. And then he goes back home and accesses public TV, a state-owned property, again in the evening. We thus begin to recognize that property is an everyday phenomenon. It is differently constructed, maintained, and managed in different times and places. It enables different things for different people, and it restricts them differently too. It demands reading for difference. In this picture, we see property diversity, a table for property diversity. Again, just examples for different forms of property. And we're also starting to think about regulations of their access and who gets to access different forms of property and who gets to use them, who gets benefits from different forms of property. So on the left, we see different categories such as open access property, privately owned property, and collectively owned or managed properties. And on the right, we see the column is called regulating access. We think about who regulates and what regulates who has access to a specific form of property. So for the atmosphere, a typical open access property, there is really no one regulating access, fortunately, to this form of property. For indigenous lands and rivers and sea, we might have ancestral rights and treaties regulating who has access to them and on what conditions. For private individual forms of private property, we have private property rights, setting the rights and the rights of access and the rules of benefit for those forms of property. And for common property, we have rules of commoning, always set and co-managed by those who are practicing commoning in that specific form of property. So again, this is just a way to visualize and start to think about the diversity, the heterogeneity of different forms of property and the rules that set who has access to them and who gets benefits from them. This allows us to ask more specific questions about what to do with all this knowledge then. We may begin to ask what benefits or struggles could arise from collectively managing properties or resources that are currently enclosed and managed by and for the few. We may also begin to ask how the kind of open access resources currently not managed consciously, collectively, and democratically could be. In this table, or with this table, we're thinking about different ways of commoning. So not commons as a legal category so much, but ways of commoning, practices of commoning that we can perhaps practice wherever and with whatever properties. This table has two layers, really, I need to talk about. To get a general picture, we have different categories on the horizontal axis. So we're thinking about the access to different resources. We're thinking about use of different resources, who gets to use them. We're thinking about forms of benefit, who gets to benefit from different resources. We're thinking about forms of care, so what kind of practices of care and maintenance and management are related to different forms of resources. Next category, we're thinking about responsibility, so who is responsible for maintaining these resources. And in the last category, we're thinking about ownership, so who has the legal ownership over a specific form of resources. And on the left, the vertical axis, we have three categories. So first we have the category of enclosed resources, then we have the category of the commons, and then we have the category of unmanaged resources. And we can read this table horizontally. So firstly, for instance, for enclosed privately owned resources, the access is usually pretty narrow, the use is restricted by the owner, the benefits are private, and the responsibilities are assumed by the owner. For the legal category of the commons, the access is shared and wide, the uses are managed by the community, and forms of care are performed by community members, and responsibility over the resources are assumed by the community. And for unmanaged resources or open access resources, the access is usually unrestricted, use is open and unregulated, benefits are to the finders keepers, and forms of care and responsibility very often can be lacking. But this is kind of the first layer of this table, but there's a dynamic layer because we see different arrows leading from different legal categories on the left, from enclosed resources, from the commons, and from unmanaged resources to the middle horizontal axis, meaning that each different property category can be commoned. Practices of commoning can make each property category into a form of commons dynamically if we shift and change the rules in practice. So a form of enclosed resource can be commoned in different ways. It can be rendered as a community managed resource. Responsibility can be assumed by the community. We just need to be inventive. And similarly, unmanaged resources can be brought into a communal or a democratic or a collective management. That can be hard, but it's also possible. So that, for instance, the open and unregulated use of this property starts to be managed by a community. The unrestricted access starts to be ruled by a shared and wide process. And responsibility over this previously unmanaged resource can be assumed by a specific community. So in this way, this table of at least two layers is really a way to explore both the legal categories of different resources and who gets to use them and so on, and also the dynamic processes of commoning that can make any form of property into a time and place specific process of commoning. Importantly, this is not only about work here and now for those currently occupying this planet. The commons yardstick helps us to reach back and forth in time and to think with a temporal depth that we really ought to be thinking with. In this case, 7 generations or 150 years ahead, but also 3 generations back in time. This expands our view of who and what the commons is for. Okay, so here we have a commons yardstick, which is just a tool for thinking about years and generations ahead in time and back in time. So each generation here equals 25 years. So we can think of 1 generation back in time, and we can think of 2 generations back in time, our grandparents' generation, and that's roughly 50 years back in time. And great-grandparents' generation is roughly 75 years back in time. And then we can think of up to 7 generations ahead in time. So that's up to 150 plus years from now. And this tool really is just to help us think about currently managed forms of property and of practices of commoning to kind of expand the temporal thinking and the ethical thinking that we are practicing around forms of property, and to think about who we're kind of inheriting, who we are responsible for in due time. This is kind of work that can and in some sense needs to be done everywhere. And just like the words for and meanings of property or ownership are different in each place, culture and language, it is the local circumstances and situated negotiations that need to challenge and rethink what commoning means and what forms it can take in each case. Essentially, then, a post-capitalist approach needs reinventing each time anew. In the same way, we may perhaps begin to think of the specific questions of international political economy through a critique of capitalocentrism, a mapping of diverse economies, and a post-capitalist politics of collective actions. Wherever we are, whatever our specific concerns or interests, we may test some of these tools to think about and amplify alternatives, not as ephemeral promises, but as actually existing, embodied, situated struggles and negotiations. Whatever our concerns, it is worth asking with Gibson-Graham, I quote, "What if we were to accept that the goal of theory is not to extend knowledge by confirming what we already know, that the world is a place of domination and oppression? What if we asked theory instead to help us see openings, to provide a space of freedom and possibility. End of quote. Now it's time to wrap up. Hope you've enjoyed this short introduction to the post-capitalist approach of J.K. Gibson-Graham and other community economy scholars. You may find many of these tools I've discussed, as well as different learning materials and a wide range of literature at the website communityeconomist.org. Feel free to get in touch with any ideas, questions, or comments about this lecture, and thanks for watching.